Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Welcome to our deep dive into appeasement. It's a strategy that's often misunderstood and carries a heavy weight of historical baggage, especially when we consider the events leading up to World War II. It's fascinating how the ghost of appeasement from the 1930s seems to be haunting the West's response to modern-day Russia.
Appeasement, you see, is a diplomatic strategy, making political or material concessions to an aggressive power in order to avoid conflict. It's rooted in the idea that by addressing the grievances of the aggressor, you can satisfy their demands and prevent further aggression.
So let's unpack the origins of appeasement in the context of post-World War I Europe. Imagine Europe in the aftermath of the Great War. Mass casualties, economic devastation, and a profound sense of disillusionment. Another devastating conflict was the last thing anyone wanted.
Indeed, the trauma of World War I, often referred to as the Great War, played a pivotal role in shaping the appeasement policies of the 1930s. The war had left an indelible mark on European nations, both physically and psychologically. The memory of the unprecedented carnage and destruction fueled a deep desire to avoid another conflict at all costs. This collective aversion to war created a climate where appeasement seemed like a viable option.
And this desire for peace at all costs translated into the policy of appeasement. However, it's essential to understand the complex dynamics at play. There wasn't a monolithic view of appeasement. Rather, it was a strategy shaped by a variety of factors, including genuine pacifism, economic considerations, and political maneuvering.
You're absolutely right. There were various schools of thought within the appeasement camp. Some individuals, like British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, were driven by a genuine belief in pacifism and a conviction that dialogue and concessions could avert war. Others were motivated by economic concerns, believing that appeasing Germany would preserve trade relationships and prevent further economic hardship. Still, others saw appeasement as a political tactic to buy time, hoping to strengthen their own defenses while delaying a confrontation they felt unprepared for.
One of the key factors that contributed to the rise of appeasement was the widespread belief that the Treaty of Versailles, which officially ended World War I, had been overly harsh on Germany. Many argued that the treaty's punitive measures, such as territorial losses, disarmament, and heavy reparations, had created resentment and instability in Germany, fostering an environment ripe for the rise of extremist ideologies.
The Treaty of Versailles, while intended to ensure lasting peace, inadvertently sowed the seeds of future conflict. The treaty imposed severe restrictions on Germany's military capabilities, limiting the size of its army, prohibiting the development of certain weapon systems, and imposing strict controls on its industrial capacity. These limitations were deeply resented by many Germans who viewed them as humiliating and unfair. Moreover, the treaty mandated significant territorial concessions from Germany, including the loss of Alsace-Lorraine to France, and the ceding of other territories to newly formed nations. These losses further fueled a sense of grievance and nationalist sentiment in Germany.
And it's crucial to recognize that this view of the Treaty of Versailles was not universally held. Some argue that the treaty was necessary to ensure the security of Europe and prevent German aggression in the future. They pointed to Germany's role in initiating World War I and the need to hold it accountable for its actions. However, the perception that the treaty was unjust gained traction, particularly in the aftermath of the Great Depression, which hit Germany exceptionally hard.
The economic crisis of the 1930s further fueled the appeal of extremist ideologies, including Nazism. Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party exploited the widespread economic hardship and social unrest, promising to restore Germany's greatness and overturn the perceived injustices of the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler's message resonated with the population desperate for solutions and susceptible to his charismatic leadership and nationalist rhetoric.
In this context, appeasement emerged as a seemingly attractive option for Western powers. They hoped that by making concessions to Germany, they could address its grievances, dampen the appeal of extremism, and prevent another devastating war. It was a gamble based on the hope that Hitler's ambitions could be contained and that he would ultimately be satisfied with limited gains.
British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain emerged as a key figure in advocating for appeasement. He genuinely believed that by offering concessions, he could satisfy Hitler's demands and secure peace. Chamberlain viewed Hitler as a rational actor who could be reasoned with, and whose demands were, in his view, at least partially justified. He believed that by addressing those grievances, a lasting peace could be achieved.
And Chamberlain wasn't alone in this belief. French Prime Minister Edouard Daladier, while perhaps more hesitant than Chamberlain, also saw appeasement as the most viable option. France, still recovering from World War I and facing its own internal political divisions, was reluctant to risk another conflict, especially without the full support of Great Britain. The French government's policy was largely driven by a desire to avoid war, and a belief that concessions might buy them time to prepare for a potential conflict.
The French perspective was also shaped by their geographical proximity to Germany and the traumatic memories of the German invasion and occupation during World War I. The devastation inflicted on French soil had left a deep scar on the nation's psyche. The French military leadership, while aware of the growing threat posed by Germany, was hesitant to engage in a conflict that they feared they might not win. This apprehension contributed to their willingness to explore diplomatic options, even if it meant making concessions to an aggressive power.
Now let's delve into some specific examples of appeasement policies enacted during this period, starting with the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936. In direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany remilitarized this area, and Britain and France, shockingly, did not intervene.
This was a pivotal moment. It was a clear test of the resolve of the Western powers, and their failure to respond emboldened Hitler. The remilitarization of the Rhineland was a strategic victory for Hitler, strengthening his position both domestically and internationally. Domestically, it boosted his popularity and legitimized his regime in the eyes of the German people. It demonstrated his willingness to defy the Treaty of Versailles and assert German power. Internationally, the lack of a strong response from Britain and France signaled their unwillingness to confront Germany militarily, emboldening Hitler to pursue further expansionist goals.
This event marked a turning point in the trajectory of appeasement. Hitler had successfully challenged the Treaty of Versailles, demonstrating his willingness to use force to achieve his goals. The lack of a meaningful response from the Western powers only reinforced his belief that they were weak and indecisive, unwilling to risk a confrontation.
The remilitarization of the Rhineland also had significant strategic implications. It gave Germany control of a key industrial region and bolstered its defenses along its western border. This move shifted the balance of power in Europe, making it more difficult for France to defend itself against a potential German attack. The lack of intervention by Britain and France also undermined their credibility as guarantors of European security. It sent a message to other nations that the Western powers were not willing to stand up to German aggression, emboldening other revisionist powers and contributing to a climate of instability.
Emboldened by his success in the Rhineland, Hitler set his sights on Austria, a country with deep cultural and historical ties to Germany. In March 1938, German troops marched into Austria, and Hitler proclaimed the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria into the German Reich. Again, there was no significant opposition from Britain or France.
The Anschluss was another blatant violation of the Treaty of Versailles, which explicitly prohibited the union of Austria and Germany. However, the Western powers, preoccupied with their own domestic issues and still hesitant to risk war, chose to accept the annexation as a fait accompli. They issued diplomatic protests, but took no concrete action to prevent or reverse the annexation. The Anschluss was a significant strategic gain for Germany, expanding its territory and population and bringing it closer to achieving its goal of creating a greater German Reich.
The annexation of Austria further eroded the credibility of the Western powers and strengthened Hitler's position. It demonstrated that his expansionist ambitions were not limited to revising the Treaty of Versailles, but encompassed a broader vision of German dominance in Europe. This realization, however, was slow to dawn on Western leaders, who continued to cling to the hope that appeasement could still preserve peace.
The events in Austria also had a profound impact on the international perception of Hitler and his regime. The lack of resistance from the Western powers painted a picture of weakness and indecision, further emboldening Hitler and encouraging him to believe that he could achieve his goals without facing serious consequences. The international community watched with growing concern as Hitler's ambitions grew, and the specter of war loomed larger on the horizon.
The annexation of Austria marked a significant escalation in Hitler's aggressive foreign policy. However, the most consequential act of appeasement was yet to come. In September 1938, Hitler demanded the annexation of the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a significant German population.
The Sudetenland crisis brought Europe to the brink of war. Hitler's demands on Czechoslovakia were met with resistance from the Czech government, which had a well-trained army and a system of alliances with France and the Soviet Union. However, the British and French governments, desperate to avoid war, pressured Czechoslovakia to make concessions.
British Prime Minister Chamberlain, convinced that he can reason with Hitler, engaged in a series of high-stakes negotiations. These culminated in the infamous Munich Agreement, signed on September 30, 1938. The agreement ceded the Sudetenland to Germany. ostensibly in exchange for Hitler's promise that this would be his last territorial demand in Europe.
The Munich Agreement is widely regarded as the epitome of appeasement and a catastrophic failure of diplomacy. It emboldened Hitler, who saw the concessions as a sign of weakness and indecision on the part of the Western powers. The agreement also shattered the credibility of Britain and France, who had abandoned their ally Czechoslovakia to its fate.
Chamberlain, upon his return to Britain, famously declared that he had achieved peace for our time. This statement, tragically misguided as it turned out, reflected the deep-seated desire for peace that had driven the policy of appeasement. However, the peace that Chamberlain believed he had secured proved to be illusory.
The Munich Agreement, far from averting war, merely postponed it. Hitler, emboldened by his success in Czechoslovakia, now set his sights on Poland. On September 1st, 1939, German forces invaded Poland, marking the beginning of World War II. The policy of appeasement had failed to prevent the very conflict it had been designed to avoid.
The failure of appeasement in the 1930s had profound and lasting consequences. It led to the most devastating conflict in human history, resulting in millions of deaths and untold suffering. It also shattered the illusion that aggression could be contained through concessions and diplomacy alone. The lessons of appeasement have continued to shape international relations in the decades since World War II.
The historical legacy of appeasement is a complex and controversial one. It serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of accommodating aggressive powers and the importance of standing up for principles of international law and sovereignty. However, it's also important to remember that the context of the 1930s was unique, and that applying the lessons of appeasement to contemporary situations requires careful consideration and nuanced analysis.
Now, having established the historical context of appeasement, let's shift our focus to the post-Soviet world and explore the parallels with Russia's actions in Ukraine. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 dramatically reshaped the global geopolitical landscape. A key player in this new world order was Ukraine, which emerged as an independent nation and significantly inherited a large nuclear arsenal from the Soviet era.
Ukraine's possession of nuclear weapons made it a significant player in the post-Soviet world. It possessed the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, after the United States and Russia. This arsenal included intercontinental ballistic missiles, strategic bombers, and tactical nuclear weapons. Ukraine's nuclear inheritance presented both opportunities and challenges. It provided a potential deterrent against Russian aggression, but it also raised concerns about the security and safety of these weapons in a newly independent and politically unstable country.
The existence of this nuclear arsenal added a layer of complexity to Ukraine's relationship with both Russia and the West. Russia viewed Ukraine's nuclear weapons with unease, fearing that they could be used against them or fall into the wrong hands. The West, meanwhile, was concerned about the proliferation of nuclear weapons and the potential for these weapons to be used in a regional conflict or to be acquired by terrorist groups.
This complex situation led to a series of diplomatic efforts aimed at resolving the issue of Ukraine's nuclear weapons. These efforts culminated in the Budapest Memorandum, signed in 1994 by Ukraine, Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom.
The Budapest Memorandum was a key agreement that shaped the security landscape of post-Soviet Europe. It was intended to provide Ukraine with security assurances in exchange for giving up its nuclear arsenal. Under the terms of the memorandum, Ukraine agreed to accede to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, NPT, as a non-nuclear weapons state, and to transfer all its nuclear weapons to Russia for dismantling. In return, Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom pledged to respect the independence and sovereignty and the existing borders of Ukraine, and to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of Ukraine.
The Budapest Memorandum was hailed as a major diplomatic achievement at the time. It was seen as a significant step toward reducing the global nuclear threat, and as a model for resolving similar situations in the future. However, the memorandum's lack of enforcement mechanisms and its reliance on the good faith of the signatories would prove to be its fatal flaw.
The Budapest Memorandum, in hindsight, seems to have been tragically inadequate. The memorandum lacks specific enforcement mechanisms, relying instead on the commitment of the signatories to uphold its provisions. This reliance on good faith would prove to be a crucial miscalculation.
The lack of concrete enforcement mechanisms in the Budapest Memorandum left Ukraine vulnerable to potential violations. The memorandum did not establish a clear process for responding to violations, nor did it create any binding obligations on the signatories to come to Ukraine's defense in the event of an attack. This ambiguity would have significant consequences when Russia violated the memorandum in 2014.
As Russia, under Vladimir Putin, began to reassert itself on the world stage, it became increasingly clear that the Budapest Memorandum was not going to be enough to protect Ukraine. Putin's vision of a resurgent Russia, one that reasserted its influence in its near abroad, clashed with Ukraine's aspirations for closer ties with the West. This growing tension would eventually lead to a major crisis in 2014.
Putin's foreign policy was driven by a desire to restore Russia's status as a great power, and to reassert its influence in the former Soviet republics, which he viewed as falling within Russia's sphere of influence. Ukraine, with its large Russian-speaking population and its strategic location on the Black Sea, was a key target of Putin's ambitions.
This brings us to the pivotal year of 2014 and Russia's annexation of Crimea. The annexation was a blatant violation of international law and a direct challenge to the post-Cold War order. It sent shockwaves through the international community and drew immediate comparisons to the appeasement policies of the 1930s. The annexation of Crimea was a watershed moment in post-Cold War history. It marked a turning point in Russia's foreign policy, signaling a willingness to use military force to achieve its geopolitical objectives, and it exposed the limitations of the post-Cold War security architecture, particularly the weakness of the Budapest Memorandum security guarantees.
The annexation of Crimea was a carefully planned and executed operation. Russian forces, operating under the guise of local self-defense militias, swiftly seized control of key strategic locations on the peninsula. The Ukrainian military, unprepared and outnumbered, offered little resistance. Within weeks, a hastily organized referendum was held, in which a majority of Crimean voters, under duress and with limited international monitoring, opted to join Russia. The international community, with the exception of a few countries, condemned the annexation as a violation of international law, but was unable to prevent it.
Russia's justification for the annexation was based on a narrative of protecting the rights of ethnic Russians in Crimea who, according to Moscow, were facing persecution from the Ukrainian government. This narrative, however, was widely disputed by international observers and human rights organizations.
Russia's claims of protecting ethnic Russians were largely seen as a pretext for its actions. There was no evidence of widespread or systematic persecution of Russians in Crimea prior to the annexation. Moreover, the annexation was carried out in a manner that violated the principles of self-determination and territorial integrity, enshrined in international law.
The annexation of Crimea drew immediate comparisons to the appeasement policies of the 1930s, just as Hitler had used the pretext of protecting ethnic Germans to justify his annexation of the Sudetenland. Putin was seen as employing similar tactics to expand Russia's territory and influence. This historical parallel raised concerns that Russia's actions in Crimea might be just the beginning of a larger campaign to destabilize Ukraine and potentially other neighboring countries.
The parallels between Russia's actions in Crimea and the events leading up to World War II were striking. In both cases, an aggressor state used the pretext of protecting ethnic kin to justify the violation of another country's sovereignty. In both cases, the international community was slow to react, hesitant to take decisive action to confront the aggressor. This sense of historical déjà vu fueled anxieties about the potential for a wider conflict in Europe.
The West's response to the annexation of Crimea was initially hesitant and largely limited to economic sanctions and diplomatic condemnation. The United States, the European Union, and other Western countries imposed a series of targeted sanctions on Russian individuals and entities involved in the annexation. These sanctions were designed to inflict economic pain on Russia and to deter further aggression, but they were carefully calibrated to avoid a full-blown economic war.
The West's decision to pursue a policy of sanctions rather than military intervention was driven by a number of factors. First, there was a recognition that direct military confrontation with Russia, a nuclear-armed state, carried unacceptable risks of escalation. Second, there was a hope that economic sanctions combined with diplomatic pressure could persuade Russia to change course. Finally, there were concerns about the potential economic consequences of a more aggressive response, particularly for European countries that were heavily reliant on Russian energy imports.
Diplomatically, Russia was isolated. It was suspended from the G8, the group of leading industrialized nations, and faced widespread condemnation in international forums. However, these measures had limited impact on Russia's behavior. The Putin regime, bolstered by domestic support and a robust economy, seemed unfazed by Western sanctions and diplomatic pressure.
Russia's response to Western sanctions was a combination of defiance and adaptation. The Putin regime tightened its control over the domestic media, portraying the sanctions as an act of Western aggression aimed at weakening Russia. At the same time, Russia sought to diversify its economic relationships, forging closer ties with China and other countries outside the Western sphere of influence. The sanctions, while imposing some costs on the Russian economy, did not have the desired effect of changing Russia's policy toward Ukraine.
The limited military support provided to Ukraine was another aspect of the West's response. The United States and other NATO members provided Ukraine with non-lethal military aid, such as training, equipment, and intelligence sharing. However, they stopped short of providing Ukraine with lethal weapon systems, fearing that such a move would be seen as escalatory by Russia and could lead to a wider conflict.
The West's reluctance to provide Ukraine with lethal weapons systems was a subject of intense debate. Some argued that such assistance was necessary to deter further Russian aggression and to enable Ukraine to defend itself effectively. Others maintained that providing lethal weapons would only escalate the conflict and could lead to a dangerous spiral of violence. The decision to withhold lethal aid reflected a deep-seated fear of provoking a direct confrontation with Russia, a fear rooted in the memories of the Cold War and the specter of nuclear conflict.
This reluctance to engage militarily, much like in the 1930s, was driven by the hope that economic and diplomatic pressure would be enough to contain Russia and avoid a larger conflict. This approach, however, carried the risk of emboldening further Russian aggression, as Putin might perceive the West's hesitation as a sign of weakness.
The West's policy toward Russia in the aftermath of the annexation of Crimea was a delicate balancing act. It sought to punish Russia for its actions, deter further aggression, and support Ukraine's sovereignty, while at the same time avoiding a direct military confrontation with a nuclear-armed power. This approach, however, was fraught with risks and uncertainties. The lack of a clear and decisive response left open the possibility that Russia might miscalculate the West's resolve and escalate its aggression further.
The annexation of Crimea had profound implications for international relations and the future of global security. It demonstrated the willingness of a major power to violate international law and redraw borders by force. It exposed the limitations of the post-Cold War security architecture, particularly the weakness of security guarantees provided to non-nuclear states. It also raised questions about the effectiveness of economic sanctions and diplomatic pressure as tools for deterring aggression.
The annexation of Crimea ushered in a new era of geopolitical uncertainty and instability. It marked a return to great power competition and a shift away from the rules-based international order that had prevailed in the aftermath of the Cold War. The long-term consequences of this shift are still unfolding, but it's clear that the world is entering a more dangerous and unpredictable phase.
The annexation of Crimea also had a profound impact on Ukraine's domestic politics and society. It galvanized Ukrainian national identity and strengthened support for closer ties with the West. It also led to a surge in pro-Western sentiment and a rejection of Russia's historical and cultural influence.
The annexation of Crimea was a traumatic experience for Ukraine. It resulted in the loss of territory, the displacement of thousands of people, and the imposition of economic hardship. However, it also had the unintended consequence of uniting Ukrainians against a common enemy and strengthening their resolve to build a democratic and independent nation free from Russian interference.
The parallels between the appeasement of the 1930s and the West's response to Russia in the 21st century are undeniable. Both involved concessions to an aggressor and a reluctance to engage militarily. Both were driven by a desire to avoid war, but ultimately failed to prevent it.
The historical analogy of appeasement, while imperfect, offers valuable insights into the dynamics of international relations and the challenges of dealing with aggression. It highlights the importance of understanding the motivations and goals of aggressors, the need for a clear and consistent policy response, and the risks of making concessions that are perceived as weakness.
However, it's important to note that the historical context of the 1930s was unique, and that the situation in Ukraine is distinct in several important ways. The existence of NATO, a collective defense alliance that did not exist in the 1930s, provides a greater degree of deterrence against Russian aggression. The nature of the conflict is also different, with the West focusing on economic and diplomatic pressure rather than territorial concessions.
While there are important differences between the 1930s and the current situation in Ukraine, the lessons of appeasement remain relevant. The failure to confront aggression decisively can embolden aggressors and create a climate of instability. That can lead to wider conflict. The West's response to Russia's actions in Ukraine must be calibrated to deter further aggression, support Ukraine's sovereignty, and uphold international law.
This complex situation presents the West with a difficult dilemma. On the one hand, it must avoid actions that could escalate the conflict and lead to a direct military confrontation with Russia. On the other hand, it cannot allow aggression to go unpunished and must take steps to deter further violations of international norms.
The West's policy toward Russia must be guided by a clear understanding of its interests and goals. It must be firm in its defense of international law and the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. It must also be prepared to impose costs on Russia for its actions, while at the same time leaving open the possibility of dialogue and diplomacy.
The situation in Ukraine is a test of the West's resolve and its commitment to the principles of the international order. The choices it makes in the coming months and years will have profound implications for the future of Europe and the world.
The world is watching closely how this situation unfolds and what lessons will be drawn from it. The stakes are high, and the consequences of miscalculation are potentially catastrophic.
Our deep dive into appeasement has revealed uncomfortable truths about the complexities of international relations and the enduring challenges of dealing with aggression. It's a topic that deserves our continued attention and careful consideration, because the choices we make today will shape the world of tomorrow. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.